Let me tell you something that took me years to figure out, and once I did, it changed everything about how I approached problems. People always asked me, Feynman, how do you understand things so quickly? How do you grasp concepts that take other people weeks or months? And I would tell them the truth. I'm not smarter than anybody else. I just have a method, a way of forcing my brain to actually understand something instead of just pretending to understand it. You see, most people don't realize they're fooling themselves. They read something, they nod along, they think they get it, and then 2 days later they couldn't explain it to save their lives. That's not understanding. That's the illusion of understanding. And I figured out pretty early on that if you want to really grasp something, you have to do something that feels almost embarrassingly simple. I'm going to tell you about this method, how I developed it, and why it works. And I think if you actually use it, you'll be able to force your brain to understand almost anything in about 20 minutes. That's not an exaggeration. 20 minutes of focused effort using this approach beats hours of passive reading. Now, let me start with how I discovered this. When I was young, maybe 11 or 12 years old, I was already fascinated by how things worked. I'd read the encyclopedia, I'd tinker with radios, I'd try to figure out the mechanisms behind everyday stuff. But here's the thing that frustrated me. I'd read an explanation, I'd think I understood it, and then my father would ask me a simple question about it and I'd freeze. I couldn't answer. The knowledge was in my head somewhere, but it wasn't mine. I hadn't really digested it. My father was brilliant about this, actually. He wasn't a scientist himself, but he understood something fundamental about learning. He would always ask me, "Can you explain it in simple terms? Can you tell me what it really means?" And most of the time, I couldn't. I had memorized words, phrases, definitions, but I hadn't understood the thing itself. So I started doing something different. Whenever I encountered a new concept, I would try to explain it out loud, as if I were teaching it to someone who knew nothing about the subject. At first, I did this in my head, but then I realized it was even more effective if I actually wrote it down or spoke it out loud. There's something about articulating an idea that exposes all the gaps in your understanding. Here's what I mean. Let's say you're trying to understand something like, oh, I don't know, quantum electrodynamics, which, by the way, is what I ended up working on for most of my career. If you just read about it in a textbook, you encounter all these technical terms, all these mathematical formulas, and your brain kind of glazes over. You think you're following along because the words are making grammatical sense, but you're not really understanding anything. Now, if instead you try to explain quantum electrodynamics to an 8-year-old, something interesting happens. You can't use the jargon. You can't hide behind the formulas. You have to actually figure out what the thing is about. And that's when you discover all the places where your knowledge is fuzzy, where you've been fooling yourself into thinking you understand when you really don't. I'll give you a concrete example from my own experience. When I was at MIT, I took a course on optics. The professor was excellent, very thorough, covered everything you needed to know about light and lenses and refraction. I took careful notes. I did well on the exams. By all conventional measures, I understood optics. But then one day, I was trying to explain to a friend why a rainbow forms, and I got stuck. I knew it had something to do with refraction and the different wavelengths of light bending at different angles inside water droplets. But when I tried to walk through exactly how that happened, step by step, I realized I didn't actually understand it. I had memorized the explanation, but I couldn't reconstruct it from first principles. So I went back. I sat down with a piece of paper and I tried to explain, in the simplest possible terms, what happens to a beam of white light when it enters a water droplet. And every time I got stuck, every time I couldn't explain the next step clearly, I went back to my notes and the textbook, not to memorize more, but to really understand that specific gap. It took me maybe 20 minutes. At the end of it, I could explain the rainbow to anyone, not because I had memorized more stuff, but because I had forced my brain to actually work through the mechanism. I had filled in all the gaps. That's when I realized this wasn't just a study technique, it was a fundamental principle of how understanding works. You don't really know something until you can explain it simply. And the act of trying to explain it simply is what forces you to actually understand it. Now, let me tell you how this evolved as I got more involved in serious physics. At Los Alamos, during the war, we were working on problems that nobody had ever solved before. There was no textbook. There was no professor to ask. We had to figure things out ourselves. And I noticed something interesting about the way different people approached this. Some of the physicists would get tangled up in the mathematics. They'd write equations on the blackboard, manipulate symbols, derive results, and sometimes those results were correct. But when you asked them what the results meant, they couldn't tell you. They had done the math right, but they hadn't understood the physics. I developed a different habit. Before I would do any calculation, I would try to visualize what was actually happening physically. I would ask myself, what is this equation trying to describe? What would it look like if I could see it? And I would try to explain it to myself in words, not symbols. Only after I had a clear mental picture would I start doing the math. This drove some of my colleagues crazy, by the way. They would say, "Feynman, just calculate it. Why are you wasting time with these hand-wavy explanations?" But I found that when I understood something intuitively first, the mathematics became much easier. I wasn't just pushing symbols around anymore. I was describing something real. Hans Bethe noticed this about me. He once said that I had an unusual ability to come up with the answer before I could prove it, and people thought this was some kind of intuition or natural talent. But it wasn't. It was just that I had spent so much time forcing myself to understand things simply that I had developed good physical intuition. I could see where the equations were going because I understood what they were describing. Now, let me be more specific about the method itself. Here's how you actually do this. It's very simple, really. First, you pick something you want to understand. It could be anything, a physics concept, a historical event, how a car engine works, whatever. You identify the thing you want to grasp. Second, you get a blank piece of paper. At the top, you write down the concept you're trying to understand, and then you start explaining it, in writing, as if you were teaching it to someone who knows nothing about the subject. A child, basically. You use simple words. You avoid jargon. You work through it, step by step. Third, and this is the crucial part, you pay attention to where you get stuck. Where does your explanation become vague? Where do you find yourself wanting to use a technical term without really explaining what it means? Where do you skip over a step because you're not sure of the details? These are the gaps. These are the places where you don't actually understand. Fourth, you go back to your source material, whatever it is, textbook, articles, videos, whatever. But you don't just read broadly, you focus specifically on the gaps you identified. You're not trying to absorb everything again. You're just trying to fill in the specific holes in your understanding. Fifth, you try the explanation again, and you keep going until you can explain the whole thing simply and clearly without getting stuck anywhere. That's it. That's the whole method. It sounds almost too simple to be useful, but I'm telling you, it works better than anything else I've ever found. The reason it works, if you want to understand the psychology of it, is that it forces your brain to do the hard work of integration. When you just read something passively, your brain doesn't have to organize the information in any particular way. It can store it as disconnected fragments. But when you have to explain something coherently, your brain has to actually connect the pieces. It has to figure out how one thing leads to another. It has to build a structure. And when you hit a gap, when you can't explain something, that's your brain telling you that the structure isn't complete. There's a missing piece, and now you know exactly where to look for it. I used this method throughout my career. When I was learning about the weak nuclear force, when I was working on superfluidity, when I was developing the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. Every time I encountered something new, I would sit down and try to explain it simply. And every time, I would discover gaps I didn't know I had. The beautiful thing is that this works for anything, not just physics. I used the same approach when I was learning to draw. I would look at something, try to draw it, and then analyze where my drawing went wrong. What did I not understand about how light falls on a surface? What did I not understand about perspective? Each failed drawing was like a failed explanation. It showed me where my understanding was incomplete. Now, here's something important. This method requires honesty, brutal intellectual honesty. You have to be willing to admit when you don't understand something. You have to be willing to feel stupid. And that's hard. Our egos want to protect us from feeling stupid. So we pretend we understand things when we don't. I see this all the time in academia, by the way. People using complicated language to hide the fact that they don't really understand what they're talking about. They've learned the jargon, they can speak the language, but if you pin them down and ask them to explain it simply, they can't, because they never did the hard work of actually understanding. Don't be that person. When you're using this method, when you're trying to explain something and you hit a gap, don't paper over it. Don't use a fancy word to hide the gap. Stop right there and admit it. Say, okay, I don't actually understand this part. Let me go figure it out. That moment of honesty is where all the learning happens. Let me tell you about a specific instance where this saved me. When I was on the Challenger Commission, investigating the space shuttle disaster, I was thrown into a world I knew almost nothing about. Solid rocket boosters, O-rings, launch procedures. This wasn't my field. I was a theoretical physicist, not an engineer. But I used the same method. I would ask the NASA engineers to explain things to me, and I would keep asking questions, sometimes questions that seemed stupid, until I really understood how things worked. Why does the O-ring need to be at a certain temperature? What happens if it gets cold? Walk me through the sequence of events. And you know what I discovered? A lot of the engineers couldn't explain it simply either. They had procedures they followed, numbers they checked, but they hadn't really integrated their understanding. They knew the rules, but not the reasons. When I finally really understood, how the O-rings worked and what temperature did to them, the cause of the disaster became clear. It wasn't complicated. It was actually very simple. But getting to that simple understanding required cutting through a lot of complexity and confusion. That's the power of this method. It cuts through to the essence of things. Now, some people ask me, but Feynman, what about things that are genuinely complicated? What about things that can't be explained simply? And I tell them this, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it. The complication is in your mind, not in the subject. Now wait, I don't mean that everything can be explained to a first grader in complete detail. What I mean is that the core idea, the essential insight, can always be stated simply. The details might take longer to work through, but the heart of any concept can be expressed in plain language. Take relativity. The core idea is that the speed of light is the same for everyone, no matter how they're moving. That's simple. Working out all the consequences of that idea takes years of study, but the fundamental principle is simple. Or take quantum mechanics. The core idea is that particles don't have definite positions or momenta until you measure them. They exist in a kind of fog of possibilities. Again, simple to state, the mathematics is intricate, but the basic concept is accessible. If you can't state the basic concept of something simply, you haven't found the core yet. You're still lost in the details. So here's what I want you to take away from this. The next time you're trying to learn something, whether it's for school or for work or just for your own curiosity, don't just read about it. Don't just watch videos about it. Take out a piece of paper and try to explain it. Write it down as if you were teaching a child. You'll feel stupid at first. You'll hit gaps you didn't know you had. You'll realize that things you thought you understood, you don't actually understand at all. Good. That's the point. That's where the learning happens. And if you do this honestly, if you keep going back and filling in the gaps, if you keep refining your explanation until it's truly simple and clear, you'll find that 20 minutes of this kind of focused effort is worth hours of passive reading. You'll have forced your brain to actually understand. And that feeling, when something that was confusing suddenly becomes clear, when you can see how it all fits together, when you could explain it to anyone, that's one of the best feelings in the world. That's the pleasure of finding things out. And it's available to anyone who's willing to do the work. The universe is not trying to hide from us. Nature is not deliberately obscure, but understanding doesn't come free. You have to wrestle with ideas. You have to struggle with them, explain them, fail, and try again. That's what I learned. That's what I'm trying to tell you. And I hope you'll try it yourself, because I think you'll be amazed at what you can understand when you stop fooling yourself and start doing the real work of learning.